The bullet missed Willa Barrett's head by inches, shattering the general store window behind her, and she didn't even flinch as she turned to face the drunk ranch hand who'd fired it. "You got a problem with me owning this store? You come say it to my face instead of shooting out my merchandise," she called out, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Denver, Colorado in 1878 was no place for a woman who couldn't hold her ground, and Willa had learned that lesson fast when she'd inherited her uncle's general store 6 months ago. The ranch hand stumbled off, muttering curses, while the crowd that had gathered dispersed with disappointed murmurs. No show today. Willa swept the glass from the boardwalk with quick, efficient movements, her jaw set in that stubborn line her late mother used to scold her about. She was 22 years old, and in the half-year since she'd arrived in Denver from Boston, she'd been propositioned, threatened, robbed twice, and told at least 100 times that she should sell the store to a man who could run it properly. Each time, she'd refused with the same iron will that had seen her through her parents' deaths and the lonely train journey west. The store was everything to her now. It represented independence, a future she could control, a life where she answered to no one. She'd rather die than give it up to some man who thought her incapable simply because she wore skirts. "You ought to be more careful," a voice said behind her, deep and measured. "That window's going to cost you." Willa turned, ready to tell whoever it was to mind their own business, but the words caught in her throat. The man standing there was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of whiskey in lamplight. He wore the dusty clothes of someone who'd been on the trail, and his dark hair needed cutting, but there was something in the way he stood, relaxed but alert, that marked him as someone who knew how to handle himself. "I can afford it," she said curtly, turning back to her sweeping. "Didn't say you couldn't." He didn't move, and she could feel his gaze on her, just making an observation, then observe somewhere else. To her surprise, he laughed, a warm sound that seemed at odds with the hardness she'd come to expect from men in this town. "You're Willa Barrett." "The one who runs the general store." "That's right." She finished sweeping and straightened, meeting his eyes directly. "And you are Samuel Zimmerman. Most people call me Sam." He shifted his weight, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "I just signed on as foreman at the Triple Creek Ranch, about 5 miles north of here. Came into town to arrange a supply account." Willa's business sense immediately overrode her irritation. The Triple Creek was one of the largest ranches in the area, and a supply account with them would go a long way towards securing her financial stability. She forced herself to soften her expression, though it didn't come naturally. "Well then, Mr. Zimmerman, why don't you come inside and we can discuss terms?" The inside of the store was dim after the bright Colorado sunshine, but neat and well organized. Willa had spent countless hours arranging the shelves, learning the inventory, figuring out what the local ranchers and townspeople needed most. She moved behind the counter with practiced ease and pulled out her accounts ledger. Samuel Zimmerman followed her inside, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He glanced around with an appraising eye, and Willa found herself standing a little straighter, wanting him to see that she ran a proper establishment. "You keep a tidy store," he said, and it sounded like genuine approval rather than surprise. "I keep a good store," she corrected. "My prices are fair, my goods are quality, and I extend credit to those who have proven trustworthy." He nodded slowly. "The Triple Creek needs a reliable supplier. We've got 30 hands now, and that number's going to grow. We'll need everything from flour and coffee to rope and hardware. Can you handle an account that size?" It was exactly the kind of business Willa needed, but she wasn't about to seem desperate. "I can handle whatever you need, Mr. Zimmerman. The question is whether the Triple Creek can handle my terms. I extend 30 days credit, but after that, interest accrues. I don't accept excuses, and I don't renegotiate for sob stories." His mouth quirked at the corner. "Tough businesswoman." "I have to be. I respect that." He moved closer to the counter, and Willa caught the scent of leather and sage. "But I'll need to see your stock before I commit. The ranch owner, Mr. Patterson, is particular about quality." They spent the next hour going through the store, with Willa showing him her inventory and Samuel asking detailed, intelligent questions that told her he knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just some cowhand promoted beyond his capabilities. He understood the needs of a large operation, and he had clear ideas about what would and wouldn't work. Despite herself, Willa found her respect for him growing. He didn't patronize her, didn't question her knowledge, didn't assume she was ignorant simply because she was a woman. When she quoted prices, he negotiated fairly, and when they disagreed on terms, he listened to her reasoning before presenting his own. By the time they shook hands on the deal, the sun was starting to sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Willa felt a satisfaction she hadn't experienced in weeks. This account would stabilize her business, give her the breathing room she needed to expand. "I'll be back tomorrow with the first order," Samuel said, settling his hat on his head. "And Miss Barrett?" "Yes." "Don't let men like that ranch hand get to you. You're doing fine on your own." Before she could respond, he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him. Willa stood in the dimming light of her store, feeling oddly unsettled. She didn't need validation from anyone, especially not some cowboy she'd just met. But something about the way he'd said it, simple and matter-of-fact as if it were obvious rather than questionable, made warmth spread through her chest. She shook her head, dismissing the feeling. She had a window to repair and inventory to check. There was no time for foolishness. Samuel Zimmerman proved true to his word. He arrived the next morning with a detailed list and a wagon, and over the following weeks, he became a regular presence at the store. Sometimes he came himself. Sometimes he sent one of the ranch hands, but more often than not, it was Samuel who walked through her door, always polite, always professional, always with that hint of warmth in his eyes that made Willa's stomach flutter in a way she absolutely refused to acknowledge. "You're going to wear a path in those floorboards," her assistant, Mary Chen, teased one afternoon. Mary was a widow in her 40s who'd needed work, and Willa had hired her despite the grumbling from some customers about having a Chinese woman in the store. Mary had proven invaluable, and more than that, she'd become something close to a friend. "I'm checking inventory," Willa said primly, though she knew perfectly well that she'd been glancing toward the door more often than necessary. Hum. And that wouldn't have anything to do with the fact that Mr. Zimmerman usually comes by around this time. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Mary laughed, the sound rich and knowing. "Willa, I've known you for 4 months now, and I've never seen you fuss with your hair before." "You like him?" "I do not," Willa said, but even to her own ears the denial sounded weak. "He's a customer, a very important customer." "It's only professional to." The door opened, and Samuel walked in, bringing with him the scent of outdoors and that easy confidence that made the space seem somehow smaller. His eyes found Willa immediately, and his face broke into a smile that did absolutely nothing to Willa's composure. "Nothing at all, Miss Barrett, Mrs. Chen," he nodded to both of them. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Mary said, her voice full of poorly suppressed amusement. "I was just going to check on the stock in the back room. Take your time." She disappeared before Willa could protest, leaving her alone with Samuel. An awkward silence fell, and Willa busied herself straightening items on the counter that didn't need straightening. "I actually didn't come for supplies today," Samuel said finally. "I came to ask you something." Willa's hand stilled. "Oh," he took off his hat, turning it in his hands in a gesture that seemed almost nervous. Samuel Zimmerman nervous. The idea was so foreign that Willa looked up at him in surprise. "There's a dance on Saturday night," he said, "at the church hall. I was wondering if you'd like to go. With me." Willa's first instinct was to say no. She didn't have time for dances or courting or any of the things that might distract her from building her business. She'd seen too many women lose themselves in marriage, their dreams and ambitions swallowed up by their husbands' needs and expectations. She'd sworn that would never happen to her. But looking at Samuel, at the genuine hopefulness in his expression, at the way he was watching her with a respect she rarely received from men, she found the refusal sticking in her throat. "I don't know," she said finally. "I'm very busy with the store, and you're always busy with the store," he interrupted gently. "Miss Barrett, Willa, if I may, I've been watching you these past weeks. You work from dawn until well past dark. You never take a day off. You never seem to do anything just for the pleasure of it. One dance won't ruin your business. You don't know that," she said, but the argument sounded weak even to her. "I know that everyone in town says you're too stubborn for your own good, that you won't accept help, won't bend, won't even take a moment to breathe." He stepped closer, and Willa found herself unable to look away from his eyes. "But the thing is, everyone says I'm too stubborn too, been that way my whole life. So maybe, just maybe, we could try being stubborn together, see what happens." Willa felt something crack in her chest, some wall she'd built so carefully starting to crumble. "Everyone says I'm too stubborn," she sighed, voicing the complaint she'd heard 100 times. The words felt heavy, carrying with them all the criticism, all the judgment, all the times she'd been told she was too much, too difficult, too unwilling to compromise. Samuel's face broke into a grin, wide and genuine and full of a warmth that made Willa's breath catch. "So am I," he said. "Let's try." It wasn't a promise that everything would be easy. It wasn't a guarantee that they were right for each other. It was just an invitation to take a chance, to see if two stubborn people might somehow fit together in a way that made sense. And despite every logical reason to refuse, despite every wall she'd built and every vow she'd made, Willa found herself nodding. "One dance," she said. "That's all." His grin widened. "One dance. I'll pick you up at 7 on Saturday." After he left, Mary emerged from the back room with a knowing smile that Willa chose to ignore. She had work to do, inventory to check, accounts to balance. She absolutely did not spend the rest of the day thinking about Samuel Zimmerman's smile, or the way he'd looked at her, or the fact that she'd just agreed to go to a dance for the first time since she'd arrived in Denver. Absolutely not. Saturday arrived with alarming speed, and Willa found herself in a state of anxiety she refused to name. She stood in front of the small mirror in her room above the store, staring at her reflection with critical eyes. She owned 3 good dresses, all practical and serviceable. Nothing fancy, nothing that would draw attention. She deliberately avoided the kind of feminine frippery that seemed designed to make women ornamental rather than useful. But now, looking at herself in the plainest of her 3 dresses, she felt suddenly uncertain. What if she looked dowdy next to the other women? What if Samuel regretted asking her? "Stop it," she told her reflection firmly. "You're going to a dance, not to your execution. And if Samuel Zimmerman doesn't like the way you look, that's his problem, not yours." Still, she found herself pinching her cheeks for color and arranging her dark hair more carefully than usual. She told herself it was simple pride, nothing more. Samuel arrived precisely at 7, cleaned up and wearing what were clearly his best clothes. His dark hair was freshly cut and he'd shaved, revealing the strong lines of his jaw. When Willa opened the door, his eyes widened slightly, and something like wonder crossed his face. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made Willa's cheeks flush. "Thank you. You look very nice as well." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. They walked through the streets of Denver in the cooling evening air, past the saloons and shops, toward the church at the edge of town. Other couples and families were heading the same direction, and Willa was acutely aware of the curious looks they received. She could practically hear the gossip starting already. The stubborn Barrett woman and the new foreman from Triple Creek. What an odd pair they made. But Samuel seemed oblivious to the stares, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He kept up an easy flow of conversation, telling her stories about the ranch, about the horses they were breeding, about his plans for improving the herd management. He spoke with an enthusiasm that was infectious, and Willa found herself relaxing despite her nerves. The church hall was decorated with wildflowers and lanterns, and a three-piece band was set up in the corner, already playing a lively tune. The dance floor was crowded with couples, and the air was full of laughter and music and the stamp of boots on wooden boards. "I should probably warn you," Samuel said as they found a spot at the edge of the room. "I'm not much of a dancer. My sister tried to teach me when we were kids, but I've got 2 left feet." "Your sister?" Willa latched onto the personal detail, curious to know more about him. His face softened. "Sarah. She died of fever when she was 12. I was 15. He looked out at the dancing couples, but Willa could see the old grief in his eyes. "She loved dancing, used to make me practice with her for hours." "I'm sorry," Willa said quietly, meaning it. "It was a long time ago." He turned back to her, managing a smile. "But it means I'm honor-bound to dance, even if I'm terrible at it. For Sarah." Something about the way he said it, the mixture of grief and love and determination, made Willa's heart ache. She understood loss. She understood the weight of carrying on when the people you loved were gone. "Then we'll be terrible together," she said, taking his hand. "I haven't danced in years." They moved onto the floor, and it quickly became apparent that neither of them had exaggerated their lack of skill. Samuel stepped on her toes twice in the first minute, and Willa lost count of the rhythm more than once. But somehow, it didn't matter. They laughed at their mistakes, adjusted their steps, and gradually found a rhythm that was uniquely theirs, not quite matching the music but working nonetheless. "See," Samuel said as they navigated a turn with only minor collisions. "2 stubborn people figuring it out." "We're terrible," Willa pointed out, but she was smiling. "We are," he agreed cheerfully, "but we're terrible together, which somehow makes it better." They danced 3 more dances, each one slightly less disastrous than the last, before taking a break to get punch. They found seats on the benches that lined the walls, and Willa was surprised to realize she was enjoying herself. When was the last time she'd done something purely for pleasure? When was the last time she'd laughed this much? "Tell me about Boston," Samuel said, handing her a cup of punch. "What made you leave?" Willa took a sip, organizing her thoughts. It wasn't a story she told often. "My parents died within 6 months of each other. Father first, from a heart condition, and then mother from pneumonia. They left debts I couldn't pay, and the only thing of value was a promise of inheritance from my uncle, my mother's brother. He had a general store out west, and he'd always said he'd leave it to me if anything happened to him." "That's a lot to lose at once," Samuel said quietly. "It was." Willa stared down at her punch. "I thought the inheritance was just talk, honestly. Uncle George and I were never close. He left Boston for Colorado before I was born, and I'd only met him twice in my life. But when my parents died and the debts came due, I wrote to him in desperation. He sent back money for the train fare and a letter saying the store would be mine when he passed. When did he die? I never met him. He died of a stroke 3 days before I arrived in Denver. She smiled bitterly at the memory. I came all this way, pinning all my hopes on this uncle I barely knew, and he was already gone. The store was mine, along with a lot of debt and a town full of people who thought I had no business trying to run it. Samuel was quiet for a moment, and when Willa glanced at him, she saw understanding in his eyes. But you kept going. What else was I going to do? Go back to Boston with nothing? At least here I had a chance. If I worked hard enough, if I was smart enough, if I refused to give up, I could make it work. She turned to face him fully. That's what people don't understand. It's not that I'm stubborn for the sake of being difficult. It's that I have to be. The moment I show weakness, the moment I compromise or bend or admit I might need help, it's over. Someone will swoop in and take what I've built, tell me it's for my own good, and I'll be right back where I started, with nothing. Is that what you think I'm trying to do? Samuel asked, his voice careful. Take what you've built? No, Willa said, and realized she meant it. I don't think that. I don't know why, but I don't. Good. He set down his punch cup and faced her, his expression serious. Because I'm not interested in taking anything from you, Willa. I've got my own dreams, my own plans. I'm not looking for a woman to run my house and bear my children and disappear into my life. I've seen too much of that, and it's never pretty. Then what are you looking for? He considered the question, his gaze drifting to the dancers. A partner, I suppose. Someone who challenges me, who has her own fire, who won't just agree with everything I say because that's what women are supposed to do. I grew up watching my mother lose herself in my father's shadow, and when she died, I don't think he even knew who she'd been beyond her role in his life. I swore I'd never do that to someone. Willa felt something loosening in her chest, some fear she hadn't fully acknowledged. That's what I'm afraid of, she admitted quietly. Losing myself, becoming just someone's wife instead of Willa Barrett, who runs her own store, who built something from nothing. Then don't, Samuel said simply. Keep being Willa Barrett, who runs her own store. Keep building. I'm not asking you to give anything up, Willa. I'm just asking if maybe we could figure this out together. Two stubborn people who refuse to compromise who they are. It should have been impossible. Everything she knew about marriage, about the expectations placed on women, told her that what he was suggesting couldn't work. But looking at him, at the honesty in his eyes, she wanted to believe it could. I don't know how to do this, she confessed. I've spent so long building walls, being independent, not needing anyone. I don't know how to let someone in without losing everything I've worked for. Well, I don't know either, Samuel said, and he smiled that warm smile that made her heart skip. But we're both stubborn enough to figure it out, don't you think? Despite herself, Willa laughed. That's either the best logic I've ever heard or the worst. Only one way to find out. They danced until the band packed up and the lanterns were dimmed. Samuel walked Willa home through the quiet streets, and they talked the whole way about everything and nothing. He told her about his plans for the ranch, about his dream of eventually having his own spread. She told him about her ideas for expanding the store, maybe even opening a second location someday. Their dreams were different but somehow complementary, and the conversation flowed as easily as water. At her door, Samuel paused, his hand still holding hers. I'd like to see you again. Not just at the store for business, really see you. Willa knew she should be cautious, should protect herself, should maybe say no. But standing there in the moonlight, her hand warm in his, she found she didn't want to be cautious. I'd like that too, she said. He smiled, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. But instead he brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles in a gesture that was somehow more intimate than a kiss on the mouth might have been. Good night, Willa Barrett. Good night, Samuel Zimmerman. She watched him walk away until he disappeared around the corner, then let herself into the store, her heart beating too fast and a smile on her face that she couldn't seem to suppress. From that night on, Samuel became a fixture in her life in a way that had nothing to do with business. He came by the store often, sometimes with orders, sometimes just to talk. They took walks on Sunday afternoons, the one day Willa forced herself to close the store. They had dinner together at the small restaurant on Main Street. They talked for hours about their pasts, their dreams, their stubborn natures that had frustrated everyone who'd ever tried to change them. And slowly, carefully, Willa felt herself falling in love. It terrified her. Love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk. She'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to risk it all on feelings that might fade or change. But Samuel was patient with her fears, never pushing, never demanding more than she was ready to give. When she pulled back, defensive and scared, he gave her space. When she reached out tentatively, trying to trust, he was there. "You're thinking too hard again," Samuel said one afternoon. They were sitting on a bench outside the store, watching the street traffic and enjoying a rare break. "I can practically hear the wheels turning." "I'm always thinking," Willa said. "It's kept me alive this long. There's thinking, and then there's worrying yourself into knots about things that haven't happened." He bumped her shoulder gently with his. "Talk to me. What's got you all tangled up?" Willa was silent for a long moment, trying to find the words for the tangle of emotions in her chest. "I'm scared," she finally said. "Of this, of us, of what it might mean." "What do you think it might mean?" "That I'll lose myself. That I'll stop being who I am and become who you need me to be. That the store will become less important and my dreams will get smaller to make room for yours." She turned to look at him, needing him to understand. "I've seen it happen to so many women, Samuel. They start out bright and full of fire, and then marriage comes along and they just dim. I can't let that happen to me." Samuel was quiet, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice was serious. "I can't promise you the future, Willa. I can't promise that everything will always be perfect, or that we'll never disagree, or that you'll never have to compromise on anything. But I can promise you this: I will never ask you to dim your light for me. Never. If anything, I want to help you burn brighter." "How can you be sure?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "How can you know you won't change your mind once we're married? That you won't start expecting me to be a traditional wife, to give up the store, to stay home, and because I know what I want, and it's you, exactly as you are." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "You know what I realized? I don't want someone easy, someone who bends and agrees and makes no demands. I want someone who challenges me, who has her own opinions, who'll call me out when I'm being an idiot. I want to come home at the end of the day and tell you about what happened at the ranch, and then hear about what happened at the store, and maybe argue about politics or business or anything else that strikes our fancy. I want a partner, Willa, not a subordinate." Tears pricked at Willa's eyes and she blinked them back fiercely. She didn't cry. Crying was weakness, and she couldn't afford weakness. But Samuel saw them anyway, and he reached up to brush a tear from her cheek with his thumb, so gentle it made her chest ache. "It's okay to be scared," he said softly. "I'm scared too. This matters to me, you matter to me, and that's terrifying. But I think we can do this. Two stubborn people figuring it out together." "You keep saying that," Willa said, managing a watery laugh. "Like being stubborn is some kind of asset in a relationship, isn't it? We're both too stubborn to give up when things get hard, too stubborn to let society tell us how we should be, too stubborn to compromise who we are at our core." He smiled. "Sounds like a pretty good foundation to me." Willa wanted to believe him. More than that, she realized she did believe him. Samuel had shown her in 100 small ways that he meant what he said. He'd never tried to control her, never questioned her business decisions, never suggested she needed protecting or managing. He treated her as an equal, and that was so rare, so precious, that she'd be a fool to let fear drive it away. "Okay," she said. "Okay, let's try." His face lit up. Yeah, she squeezed his hand, "but I'm keeping the store. I'm going to keep working, keep building my business, and if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me," Samuel finished, and there was steel in his voice. "I mean it, Willa. Your dreams are just as important as mine. We'll figure out how to make both work." They sat there in the afternoon sun, hands linked, and Willa felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Real, genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, she could have both the independence she'd fought for and the love she'd been too afraid to want. The next few months passed in a blur of happiness that Willa sometimes had to pinch herself to believe was real. Samuel courted her properly, calling on her regularly, taking her to church socials and town events, making it clear to everyone that they were together. And to Willa's surprise, the sky didn't fall. The store kept running smoothly. Her customers didn't disappear. If anything, business improved as more people from the Triple Creek and surrounding ranches started coming to her for supplies. Mary teased her mercilessly about the smile she couldn't seem to wipe off her face, but even Mary's teasing was gentle and happy. Willa had been so alone for so long, and now she had Samuel, had Mary, had a community that was slowly accepting her, not despite her stubbornness, but because of her competence and integrity. Samuel proposed on a Sunday afternoon in late September, 5 months after that first dance. They'd ridden out to a spot he'd wanted to show her, a high meadow with a view of the mountains that took Willa's breath away. The aspens were turning gold, and the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. "I love you," Samuel said as they stood looking out over the valley. "I've loved you since you told me you didn't have time for my nonsense and went back to sweeping glass off your boardwalk. I loved your strength, your stubbornness, your refusal to be anything other than exactly who you are, and I want to spend the rest of my life loving you if you'll let me." He pulled a ring from his pocket, simple gold with a small stone that caught the sunlight. "Willa Barrett, will you marry me? Will you let me be your partner, your equal, your other half in this stubborn life we're building?" Willa looked at the ring, at Samuel's hopeful face, at the mountains stretching out before them, and felt a certainty that went bone deep. This was right. He was right. Together they were right. "Yes," she said, and then louder, with all the conviction in her heart, "Yes, I'll marry you." Samuel's whoop of joy echoed across the meadow, and then he was lifting her up and spinning her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her, and it was everything Willa had been too afraid to let herself dream of. Passion and tenderness, excitement and safety, all mixed together in a way that made her dizzy. They were married in November, in the same church where they danced that first night. It was a small ceremony, just a handful of friends and Samuel's ranch colleagues, but it felt perfect. Willa wore a simple dress of deep blue, refusing the traditional white because she'd never been traditional and wasn't about to start now. Samuel wore his best suit and looked so handsome he made her heart skip. Mary Chen stood up with Willa, and Tom Patterson, the owner of Triple Creek, stood up with Samuel. The minister, a kind older man who'd been one of Willa's first supporters when she'd taken over the store, smiled warmly at them as they exchanged vows. "Do you, Samuel Zimmerman, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to honor and respect in prosperity and hardship for all the days of your life?" "I do," Samuel said firmly, his eyes never leaving Willa's face. "And do you, Willa Barrett, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to honor and respect in prosperity and hardship for all the days of your life." Willa took a deep breath, feeling the weight and joy of the moment. "I do. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Samuel, you may kiss your bride." And he did in front of God and their friends, a kiss that sealed a promise Willa knew in her soul he would keep. The reception was held at the town hall, with food and music and dancing. Willa danced with her husband, and this time they were a little less terrible at it. Practice, she thought with an internal smile. They'd had practice. "Happy," Samuel murmured as they swayed to the music. "Terrified," Willa admitted. "But yes, happy. Good, me too, on both counts." They decided to live in the rooms above the store, at least for now. Samuel would keep his position at the Triple Creek, riding out before dawn and returning in the evening. It wasn't a traditional arrangement, but nothing about their marriage was traditional. They'd make it work because they were both too stubborn to do otherwise. Their wedding night was tender and nervous and beautiful. Willa had been afraid that intimacy might somehow change things between them, might make Samuel feel he had some claim on her beyond what they'd agreed. But he was as careful with her body as he'd been with her heart, and when she woke the next morning wrapped in his arms, she felt not trapped but safe. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, but they navigated them with the same stubborn determination they'd brought to everything else. There were arguments, of course. Willa was used to making every decision herself, and it took time to remember to consult Samuel on things that affected them both. Samuel sometimes forgot that Willa's work was just as important and demanding as his own. But they talked through their disagreements, neither one willing to let resentment fester, and slowly they found their rhythm. Willa kept running the store with Mary's help, and business continued to grow. Samuel thrived as foreman of the Triple Creek, implementing new practices that increased the ranch's productivity. They were both exactly who they'd been before marriage, but now they had each other to come home to. Winter came to Denver with snow and bitter cold. The store did good business selling blankets and warm clothes and supplies to people preparing for the season. Samuel sometimes got snowed in at the ranch, unable to make it home for days at a time, and Willa learned to manage the worry that came with loving someone whose work could be dangerous. It was during one of these snowy stretches in January that trouble found Willa again. She was closing up the store one evening, Mary having already left for the day, when 3 men walked in. She recognized 2 of them as ranch hands from a spread south of town, men who'd been among her harshest critics when she'd first arrived. The third was a stranger, tall and rough-looking, with eyes that made Willa's instincts scream danger. "We're closed," she said firmly, her hand drifting toward the rifle she kept under the counter. Samuel had taught her to shoot over the past few months, insisting that she needed to be able to protect herself when he wasn't there. "We're not here to shop," the stranger said, and his smile was ugly. "We're here to deliver a message." "I'm not interested in any messages. Leave now, or I'll have the sheriff here in minutes." One of the ranch hands laughed. "Sheriff's out of town, helping with that trouble over in Clear Creek. Won't be back for days. Real convenient timing, that." Willa's heart began to pound, but she kept her expression steady. "Whatever you think you're going to do, you won't get away with it. People know I'm here. My husband will—" "Your husband snowed in at the Triple Creek," the stranger interrupted. "We made sure of that. See, there are people in this town who think you've gotten too big for your britches. A woman running a business, taking customers from good honest men who have families to feed. It's not natural and it's not right." "I've taken customers from no one," Willa said, her hand now firmly on the rifle. "I provide good service at fair prices. If that's competition, then the men you're talking about should improve their own businesses instead of sending thugs to threaten me." "Threaten?" The stranger took a step closer. "Lady, we're not here to threaten. We're here to solve a problem." Willa pulled the rifle up and cocked it in one smooth motion, pointing it directly at the stranger's chest. Her hands were steady, her gaze unwavering. "The only problem I see is 3 men who are about to have a very bad night if they don't leave my store right now." The stranger froze, his eyes widening slightly. He'd expected her to be afraid to back down. He hadn't expected a rifle pointed at his heart. "You won't shoot," one of the ranch hands said, but he sounded uncertain. "Won't I?" Willa's voice was cold. "I've worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let you destroy what I've built. You take one more step toward me, and I will put a bullet through you without a second thought. Then I'll shoot your friends. Then I'll tell the sheriff it was self-defense, because that's exactly what it is. Now get out." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the stranger slowly raised his hands and took a step back. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Willa replied. "Because you're going to leave and you're going to tell whoever sent you that Willa Barrett doesn't scare easily. And if anyone tries something like this again, next time I won't give a warning. I'll just shoot." The 3 men backed toward the door, keeping their eyes on the rifle. Once they were outside, they turned and disappeared into the snowy night. Willa held her position for a full minute after they left, making sure they were really gone, before she finally let herself lower the rifle. Her hands began to shake then, delayed reaction setting in, and she sank onto the stool behind the counter, trying to steady her breathing. She'd done it. She'd faced them down and sent them running. But the fear came flooding in now, and with it anger. Anger that she still had to fight for the right to exist, to work, to be taken seriously. Anger that there were men who thought they could intimidate her into giving up everything she'd worked for. The door burst open, and Willa had the rifle up again before she could think. But it was Samuel, covered in snow, his face wild with worry. "Willa, thank God." He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, rifle and all. "Are you all right?" "Tom and I rode through the snow when we heard there might be trouble. We ran into those men leaving town, and when they saw us coming, they took off riding hard." "What happened?" Willa told him, her voice surprisingly steady now that he was here. Samuel's face grew darker with every word, his arms tightening around her. "I should have been here," he said when she finished. "I should have. You were working," Willa interrupted, "and I handled it. I didn't need rescuing, Samuel." He pulled back enough to look at her face, and something like pride mixed with the worry in his eyes. "No, you didn't. You handled it perfectly. But God, Willa, when I thought you might be hurt, I'm fine. I was scared, but I'm fine." She managed a shaky smile. "Though I wouldn't object to you staying close tonight. I'm not leaving your side," he said firmly. "And tomorrow, we're going to figure out who sent those men and make sure they understand that threatening you means threatening both of us." They went upstairs to their rooms, and Samuel held her while she finally let herself shake, let herself feel the fear she'd pushed aside to face the threat. He murmured reassurances, his hands gentle on her back, and gradually the shaking subsided. "I'm so tired of fighting," she whispered into his shoulder. "I'm tired of having to prove myself over and over, of dealing with men who think I have no right to exist in their world." "I know," Samuel said. "I know, and it's not fair, and you shouldn't have to. But for what it's worth, I'm in awe of you. The way you stood up to them, the way you didn't back down. You're the strongest person I know, Willa. I don't feel strong right now. That's because you're human. Being strong doesn't mean never being scared. It means being scared and doing what needs to be done anyway. And that's exactly what you did." They talked long into the night, and Samuel shared his own fears about keeping her safe, about not being there when she needed him. Willa reassured him in turn, reminding him that she'd survived on her own for a long time before he came along, that his role wasn't to protect her from the world but to stand beside her as she faced it. "Partners," she said. "Remember, that's what we agreed on." "Partners," he echoed. "Even when it terrifies me. Especially then." In the morning, Samuel rode to the sheriff's office and reported the incident. The sheriff, a fair man named Walsh, took the threat seriously and promised to investigate. Word spread quickly through town, and to Willa's surprise, several people stopped by the store to express their support. The owner of the restaurant, a blacksmith who'd always been cordial, even Tom Patterson himself, all made it clear that they wouldn't tolerate threats against Willa. The men who'd confronted her left town, whether from fear of the sheriff or fear that they'd miscalculated the community's response. And the business owner who'd supposedly sent them, a bitter man who ran a poorly stocked dry goods store on the edge of town, found himself suddenly without customers. Apparently, Denver didn't take kindly to those who threatened women, even stubborn ones who refused to know their place. "Looks like you've won," Mary said one afternoon, watching Willa stock shelves. "The store's thriving, you've got people on your side, and those who tried to run you off are gone." "I don't feel like I've won," Willa admitted. "I feel like I'm still fighting, just fighting different battles. There will always be someone who thinks I shouldn't be here doing this." "Probably," Mary agreed, "but you'll keep fighting anyway. It's who you are. I suppose it is." Willa smiled at her friend. "With help from people I trust, I couldn't have done any of this alone, Mary. You know that, right? You've been invaluable." Mary's face softened. "We women have to stick together, especially the stubborn ones." Winter gave way to spring, and with the warmer weather came new challenges and opportunities. A railroad company announced plans to extend a line through Denver, which would bring more people and more business. Willa began planning an expansion of the store, calculating costs and inventory needs. Samuel's work at the ranch intensified as calving season began, but he always made time to listen to Willa's plans, to offer suggestions and support. One evening in May, as they sat on the bench outside the store watching the sunset, Samuel turned to Willa with a serious expression. "I've been thinking about the future," he said. Willa's stomach clenched slightly. This was it. He was going to tell her it was time to have children, that she needed to step back from the store, that their arrangement had to change. "Tom's thinking of retiring in a few years," Samuel continued. "He's got no children, no one to leave the ranch to. He's been dropping hints that if I wanted to buy him out, he'd give me a fair price and terms I could manage." That wasn't what Willa had expected. "Your own ranch," she said slowly. "That's what you've always wanted." "It is." He took her hand. "But it would mean a lot of work, a lot of debt, and I can't do it without talking to you first." "We're partners, Willa. I won't make a decision like that without you." Willa felt warmth spread through her chest. He meant it. He really meant it. "Tell me what you're thinking, all of it." Samuel laid out his plans. The ranch was profitable, and with the railroad coming, the market for beef was only going to grow. He had ideas for improving the breeding program, for expanding the grazing land, for turning the Triple Creek into one of the most successful operations in Colorado. It would require long hours and hard work, but he believed he could do it. "Where do I fit in all this?" Willa asked carefully. "What would it mean for the store, for my work?" "That's up to you," Samuel said. "If you want to keep running the store, we'll figure out a way to make it work. If you want to be involved in the ranch, there's room for that too. You're brilliant with numbers and organization, Willa. You could help me in ways I can't even fully imagine yet. Or you could do both or neither. The point is, it's your choice. I want the ranch, but I want you more. I won't sacrifice our marriage for a piece of land." Willa was quiet for a long time, thinking. The store was stable now, profitable, with Mary perfectly capable of managing day-to-day operations. And the idea of building something new, something bigger with Samuel, sparked a fire in her belly that she couldn't ignore. "I want to do both," she finally said. "Keep the store, but let Mary take on more management and help you with the ranch, not the cattle work but the business side. Books, suppliers, strategy. We could build something amazing, Samuel, together." His face broke into that grin she loved. Two stubborn people building an empire, something like that. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is." He kissed the top of her head. "But I think we can do it. Actually, I know we can. We've already proven that two stubborn people who refuse to give up can accomplish just about anything." They spent the next months planning and preparing. Samuel negotiated with Tom Patterson, and by August, they had an agreement. They would take over the ranch in January, with Tom staying on for 6 months to help with the transition. It was terrifying and exciting in equal measure, and Willa threw herself into preparation with the same intensity she'd brought to running the store. She promoted Mary to store manager, with a share of the profits that reflected her importance to the business. She hired 2 additional clerks to help with the increased workload, and she began learning everything she could about cattle ranching, reading books, talking to Tom, asking questions until Samuel teased her about wearing him out. "I need to understand how it all works," she insisted. "I can't help manage something I don't understand." "You're going to be better at this than I am," Samuel said, but he sounded pleased rather than threatened. In September, Willa realized she was pregnant. The discovery brought a complicated mix of emotions. She wanted children, had always assumed she'd have them someday, but the timing felt challenging. They were about to take on a ranch, to begin the biggest venture of their lives, and now there would be a baby to consider as well. She told Samuel that evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He went very still, his eyes widening, and then a smile spread across his face that was pure joy. "A baby," he breathed. "We're having a baby in March, I think." "Samuel, I know the timing isn't ideal with the ranch," he cut her off with a kiss, deep and full of love. "The timing is perfect," he said when they broke apart. "Everything is perfect. You're perfect. We're going to have a family, Willa. But the ranch and all the work, and I wanted to help you. And you will. Being pregnant doesn't make you helpless. You can still do the books, still help with planning and strategy. We'll just make adjustments as needed." He placed his hand on her still flat stomach, his expression full of wonder. "I can't believe it, a little person, half you, half me." Willa felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted, "of how it will change things, of whether I can be a good mother and still be myself." "You'll be an amazing mother," Samuel said with complete certainty. "You'll teach our children to be strong and stubborn, and to never let anyone tell them they can't do something. And you'll still be Willa Barrett Zimmerman, the woman who built her own business and helped build a ranch, and refuses to be anything other than exactly who she is." "Barrett Zimmerman," Willa repeated. She'd kept her maiden name alongside her married one, another small act of rebellion that some people had criticized. "Our poor child is going to have quite the name to live up to. They'll manage. They're going to be the child of 2 of the most stubborn people in Colorado. They won't have a choice." The pregnancy progressed, and Willa continued working right up until her body made it impractical. She helped Samuel finalize the ranch purchase, went over the books with him until they both had every detail memorized, and planned the changes they wanted to implement. Tom Patterson proved to be a good mentor, genuinely wanting them to succeed, and by January, when they officially took over, they felt as ready as they could be. The ranch house was larger than their rooms above the store, but it needed work. They spent their first weeks there cleaning, repairing, making it into a home. Willa found she enjoyed the process, putting her stamp on the space in a way that felt right. She set up an office where she could work on the ranch accounts, with a big desk by the window and shelves for all the ledgers and records. "You're nesting," Samuel observed one afternoon, watching her arrange books on the shelves for the third time. "I am not nesting. I'm organizing." "You're 5 months pregnant and organizing books by color. That's nesting." Willa looked at the rainbow of book spines and had to admit he might have a point. Fine, maybe a little nesting, but organized nesting, efficient nesting. He laughed and pulled her into his arms, careful of her growing belly. "I love you, even when you're stubborn about nesting. Especially when I'm stubborn about nesting," she corrected, and he kissed her in agreement. Their son was born on a cold March morning, arriving 2 weeks early and in a hurry, as if already impatient with the world. Samuel had ridden for the doctor, but Willa barely made it to the bed before the contractions overwhelmed her. Mary, who'd come to stay for the birth, ended up delivering the baby with help from Samuel, who was pale as milk but refused to leave Willa's side. "It's a boy," Mary announced, placing the squalling infant on Willa's chest. "A healthy, loud boy." Willa looked down at her son, this tiny person she and Samuel had created, and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. He had Samuel's dark hair and a set to his jaw that promised stubbornness in abundance. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Samuel was crying unashamedly, his hand gentle on the baby's head. "He's perfect. Willa, he's perfect. Of course he is. He's ours." She looked up at her husband. "What should we name him?" They discussed names but never quite decided. Now, looking at their son, the answer seemed obvious. "James," Samuel said softly. "After your father. James Robert Zimmerman, if that suits you." Willa felt tears slide down her cheeks. Her father, who'd died too young, who'd loved her but never quite understood her stubborn nature. "James Robert Zimmerman," she repeated. "It's perfect." The next months were a blur of sleepless nights and constant learning. Willa had thought running a business and helping manage a ranch were challenging, but they were nothing compared to caring for a baby. James was demanding and opinionated from the start, and he made his displeasure known loudly whenever his needs weren't met immediately. "He's definitely our son," Samuel said one night at 3 in the morning, pacing the floor with a crying James. "Stubborn as they come." "Wonder where he gets it," Willa said dryly from the bed, exhausted but amused. But despite the exhaustion, despite the overwhelming nature of new parenthood, they were happy. Samuel was a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor and singing off-key lullabies. Willa found that she could balance motherhood with her other responsibilities, though it took creativity and help from Mary and the ranch hands' wives. She set up a cradle in her office so she could work while James slept. She learned to do accounts one-handed while nursing. She discovered that being a mother didn't mean giving up who she was. It meant expanding to include this new role alongside all her others. The ranch thrived under their management. Samuel's innovations with the breeding program paid off, and the quality of their cattle improved noticeably. Willa's organizational skills and head for numbers meant they were profitable from the first year, even with all the initial expenses. They hired good hands, treated them fairly, and earned a reputation as decent employers in a time when that was far from universal. When James was 18 months old, Willa found herself pregnant again. This time, she was less anxious and more confident. She knew now that she could handle it, that motherhood and work weren't mutually exclusive, that she could be both mother and businesswoman and wife and still be fundamentally herself. Their daughter arrived in the winter, a tiny thing with Willa's dark eyes and a surprisingly calm temperament. They named her Clara, after Samuel's sister, and she proved to be everything James wasn't: patient, quiet, content to watch the world rather than demand its immediate attention. "We got one of each," Samuel said, cradling Clara while James played at their feet. "One stubborn like us, one peaceful like we wish we were." "Don't let Clara fool you," Willa said. "She's just quietly stubborn. Watch her with her toys sometime. She knows exactly what she wants." And Willa was right. As Clara grew, it became clear that while she might be calmer than her brother, she was every bit as determined. She just went about getting what she wanted with more subtlety. The years passed in a blur of work and family and growth. The ranch expanded. The store continued to thrive under Mary's management, and their children grew strong and healthy. Willa and Samuel weathered droughts and harsh winters, financial setbacks and personal challenges, but they weathered them together, two stubborn people who'd learned how to bend without breaking. When James was 10 and Clara was 8, they took on an orphaned boy named Daniel, the son of a ranch hand who died in an accident. Daniel was 12, angry at the world and determined not to let anyone close. But Willa saw in him the same defensive stubbornness she'd once used as armor, and she understood what he needed. "You can be angry," she told him one day when he was being particularly difficult. "You have every right to be angry at what happened to your father, at the unfairness of life. But you can be angry and still let people help you. You can be angry and still accept that maybe, just maybe, we actually care what happens to you." Daniel stared at her, his young face hard. "Why would you care? I'm nobody to you. You're somebody to yourself, and that makes you somebody to us. Your father was a good man who worked hard for this ranch, and we owe him the respect of taking care of his son. But more than that, we want to. We have room in our family and in our hearts if you'll let us in." It took time, but gradually Daniel softened. He bonded with James over horses and with Clara over books, and he came to trust that Willa and Samuel meant what they said. By the time he was 14, he called them Ma and Pa without even thinking about it, and they loved him as fiercely as they loved their biological children. The ranch became one of the most successful in Colorado, and Willa's store expanded to a second location in a neighboring town. They gave generously to the community, helping struggling families, supporting the school, contributing to the church. They'd both known poverty and struggle, and they never forgot what it felt like to be desperate. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Samuel took Willa back to the meadow where he'd proposed. The aspen trees were gold again, and the air held the same crisp promise of autumn. They were both older now, marked by sun and work and the passage of time, but the love between them had only deepened. 20 years, Samuel said, holding her hand as they looked out over the valley. 20 years of being married to the most stubborn woman in Colorado. "And you wouldn't have it any other way," Willa replied, leaning into him. "Not a chance." He turned to face her, his eyes still that same warm, whiskey color that made her heart skip. "You know what I think about sometimes. That day you told me you were too stubborn and I said so was I. Best decision I ever made, suggesting we try being stubborn together." "Everyone says I'm too stubborn," Willa quoted, remembering that moment so clearly. How scared she'd been, how uncertain, how close she'd come to saying no to this man who'd wanted to see if their stubbornness might complement rather than clash. Samuel grinned, the same grin that had melted her defenses 2 decades ago. "So am I, let's try." "And we did try," Willa said softly. "And it worked. Better than worked. It was perfect. You're perfect. This life we built is perfect." He kissed her, sweet and familiar and still capable of making her breathless. "I love you, Willa Barrett Zimmerman. I loved you then, I love you now, and I'll love you until the day I die." "I love you too," Willa said. "Even though you're terribly stubborn. Especially because I'm terribly stubborn," he corrected, echoing her words from so long ago. They stood there in the golden meadow, two stubborn people who'd refused to compromise who they were but had learned to build something beautiful together. The ranch spread out below them, the store thrived in town, and their children were growing into strong, capable people who would make their own way in the world. It was more than Willa had ever dreamed possible back when she'd been alone in Boston, desperate and grieving and trying to figure out how to survive. That night, they sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the stars come out while the sound of their children's laughter drifted from inside. James was teaching Daniel to play chess, and from the sound of it, Daniel was winning. Clara was reading aloud from a book, her voice clear and confident. "You ever miss it?" Samuel asked. "Boston, your old life, the way things might have been if you'd never come west?" Willa considered the question seriously. She thought about the woman she'd been, brittle with grief and fear, determined never to need anyone. She thought about the walls she'd built, the defenses she'd maintained, the loneliness she'd accepted as the price of independence. "No," she said finally. "I don't miss it at all. That life, that Willa, she was surviving. But this Willa, the one sitting here with you, with our family, with this life we built, she's living. And I wouldn't trade that for anything." Samuel squeezed her hand, and they sat in comfortable silence. Two stubborn people who'd found their way to each other and built something that would outlast them both. The ranch would pass to their children, the store to Mary's daughter who'd grown up learning the business, and their legacy wouldn't just be property and money but a lesson. That stubbornness didn't have to mean isolation. That strength could coexist with love, that two people could be wholly themselves and still make a whole together. Over the next decade, their children grew into adults who made them proud. James took over more of the ranch operations, proving to be as capable as his father and as business-minded as his mother. Clara married a schoolteacher and opened a bookstore in Denver, combining her love of reading with her mother's entrepreneurial spirit. Daniel became a skilled horse trainer and eventually bought a small spread of his own nearby. Willa stepped back from day-to-day management of both the store and ranch, though she remained involved in major decisions. She took up writing, recording the history of Denver and the stories of the people who'd built it. Her book about the early days of the town became a local bestseller, and she donated the proceeds to a school fund for girls, determined that the next generation of young women would have more opportunities than she'd had. Samuel developed arthritis in his hands from years of hard work, but he refused to let it slow him down much. He hired younger men to do the heavy lifting and focused on training and planning, his experience and knowledge making him invaluable even as his body began to fail him. They celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren. James had married and had 3 children of his own. Clara had 2. Daniel had one with another on the way. The ranch house rang with the sounds of family, and Willa looked around at all these people who existed because she'd once taken a chance on a stubborn cowboy who'd promised they could figure it out together. "We did good," Samuel said that night as they prepared for bed. "We did," Willa agreed. "We did very good." He pulled her close, and even after 30 years of marriage, his touch still made her heart race. They'd built this life with work and love and stubborn determination, and it was more than either of them had dreamed possible. As they grew older, their partnership only deepened. Samuel suffered a heart attack at 60, which terrified them both, but he recovered with Willa by his side every day, bullying him into following the doctor's orders. Willa developed failing eyesight, which frustrated her terribly, but Samuel read to her every evening, his voice warm and familiar. They celebrated their 40th anniversary more quietly, just the two of them and their children. The grandchildren were growing up, starting their own lives, making their own ways. The oldest, James's son Samuel Jr., had just turned 20 and was proving himself capable of taking over the ranch eventually. 40 years, Willa marveled. When I think about that terrified girl who arrived in Denver with nothing but a store she'd never seen and debts she couldn't pay, I can hardly believe this is the same life. It's not, Samuel said. It's a better life. A life you built with your own 2 hands and that stubborn spirit everyone told you to soften. You built it with me. We built it together, he corrected. Like we always said we would, 2 stubborn people figuring it out. Willa leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the weight of 4 decades of love and partnership. I'm glad you were stubborn too, she said softly. I'm glad you saw my stubbornness and didn't run away screaming. Never, Samuel said. Your stubbornness is one of my favorite things about you. Always has been. They sat together on their porch as the sun set over the mountains they'd called home for so long, 2 stubborn people who'd taken a chance on each other and built a legacy that would last long after they were gone. The ranch flourished, the store thrived, their children and grandchildren carried on their values of hard work and integrity, and never compromising who you truly were. At 73, Samuel's heart finally gave out. He died peacefully in his sleep, Willa beside him as she'd been for 45 years. The funeral brought people from all over Colorado, testimony to the man he'd been and the impact he'd made. Willa stood dry-eyed through the service, holding Clara's hand on one side and James's on the other, her grief too deep for tears. But that night, alone in the bed they'd shared for so many years, she let herself weep. For the loss of her partner, her other half, the man who'd seen her stubbornness and loved it, for all the years they'd had and all the years they wouldn't, for the hole in her life that nothing could fill. You were right, she whispered into the darkness. It did work. We were stubborn together, and it worked perfectly. Willa lived another 7 years, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, writing more books, and running a foundation that provided business loans to women entrepreneurs. She never remarried, never even considered it. She'd had her great love, her perfect partner, and nothing could replace that. On her 80th birthday, surrounded by 3 generations of family, Willa looked around at everything she and Samuel had created. Not just the ranch and the store and the material success, but this family, these people who loved each other and supported each other and carried forward the values they'd been taught. Tell us again about how you met, one of her great-grandchildren asked. About how Grandpa Sam asked you to dance. So Willa told the story, as she'd told it many times before. About the bullet through her window, about the handsome foreman who'd come to arrange a supply account, about the dance where they'd been terrible together. About how everyone had said she was too stubborn. And what did Grandpa say? The child prompted, knowing the answer but wanting to hear it anyway. Willa smiled, remembering Samuel's grin, remembering the warmth in his eyes, remembering the moment her life had changed forever. He said, "So am I." "Let's try." "And you did try," her granddaughter Clara said softly, "and you built all of this." "We did," Willa agreed. "We tried and we succeeded because we were both too stubborn to fail." She died peacefully 6 months later in her sleep, just like Samuel. Her funeral was even larger than his had been, a celebration of a remarkable life lived on her own terms. The obituary in the Denver newspaper called her a pioneer businesswoman, a successful rancher, an author, and a philanthropist. But to those who knew her best, she was simply Willa, the stubborn woman who'd refused to let the world tell her what she could and couldn't do. They buried her next to Samuel on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. James spoke at the service, his voice breaking as he talked about his mother's strength and determination. Clara read from one of Willa's books. Daniel, now in his 60s, talked about how she'd given him a home when he had nothing, but it was Samuel Jr. who perhaps summed her up best. "My grandmother taught me that being stubborn isn't a flaw," he said. "It's a strength, as long as you're stubborn in the right things." She was stubborn in her love, stubborn in her values, stubborn in her refusal to be anything less than exactly who she was, and she taught us all to be the same. To never apologize for being strong, for having opinions, for taking up space in the world. That's the legacy she leaves us, and it's worth more than all the land and money in Colorado. The ranch continued under James, and then Samuel Jr.'s management, growing and changing with the times but never losing sight of the values Willa and Samuel had instilled. The store eventually became a chain across Colorado, still bearing the Barrett name and still run by descendants of Mary Chen. The foundation Willa started helped thousands of women start their own businesses over the decades, but perhaps the greatest legacy was simpler than all that. It was in the way generations of their family learned that love didn't mean losing yourself. That partnership meant supporting each other's dreams, not sacrificing them. That two stubborn people could build something beautiful if they were stubborn in the right ways. Years later, when someone wrote a history of early Denver, they dedicated a chapter to Willa Barrett Zimmerman and her husband Samuel. They told the story of a woman who'd come west with nothing but determination and built an empire. They told the story of a man who'd seen her strength and loved it rather than fearing it. They told the story of a partnership that had lasted 45 years and changed the landscape of Colorado in ways both large and small. But they also told the story of that moment in the general store when a cowboy had asked a stubborn woman to take a chance. When she'd sighed and said everyone told her she was too stubborn. When he'd grinned and replied that so was he, and maybe they should try being stubborn together. Because sometimes the most important moments in history are the small ones, the quiet decisions that change everything, the choice to trust when trust is terrifying, the decision to try when failure seems inevitable. And sometimes, just sometimes, two stubborn people are exactly what's needed to build something that lasts.